when you're starting out, you have to make this trade-off between what's more important to me, getting, let's just say for some of these ads, a couple dozen dollars a month, or is it growth? If growth of the show is your goal, you actually want to eliminate all of that potential friction. You talk to enough successful creators, they are 100% focused on the long game, that they are willing to defer on any short-term gains and monetization and profitability to get that in a greater amount in the long term. Welcome back to another podcast roast where in every episode we dissect one of our listeners' shows' packaging, their cover art, title, show description, episode titles, to help them improve their discoverability and listener acquisition and help you along the way do the same. And today on the skewer is the Daily Sports History podcast. This is an interesting show that came up. We haven't done a sports podcast yet. And Justin, I see that you have it open in Pocket Casts. Is this a
Yes.
little departure here from Apple Podcasts, Spotify?
Yeah. You know what? I decided to bring it up in Pocket Casts, A, because they have an incredible product and team. You and I both use it. But B, because I was at a podcast conference and we were having lunch with somebody, and someone said, well, I only submit my show to Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I said, what? And they're like, well, that's where most people listen. So why is it even worth it to submit it everywhere else?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, this is the whole beauty of podcasting, is that the consumer has a choice. They can listen in Pocket Casts and Overcast, and there's hundreds of great apps that they could choose from. Spotify and Apple are the most popular, but they're not always the most popular for every show. For example, for our show, Podcast Marketing Trends Explained, if you look at our stats, Apple Podcasts is number one, but number two for us is Overcast, which is just an app made by a solo developer, Marco Arment. And then Spotify's number three, but Pocket Cast is number four. So it's not like submitting on YouTube versus Vimeo. This is a completely different ecosystem where there's all these independent players. Submit your podcast everywhere, people. It's really easy. And then people who use that app can find it. And so today I wanted to look for Daily Sports History, and kudos to them. It is on Pocket Casts. So, Jeremy, looking at the cover art, the title, and the description, what are some of your immediate thoughts?
Yeah, so Daily Sports History, when I first saw that, I was like, oh, that's actually really clear. So the first thing that I saw when it looks like the host is Ethan, submitted this show for a roast, I saw Daily Sports History. Okay, that is super clear what that show is, and I can already intuit, the general layout of the show. So that's a huge plus here. Now, when I opened up, I searched for Daily Sports History. It did come up in Apple Podcasts. It was one of the first results. In Spotify, it actually took me a little while to find it, strangely. But there may be other daily sports podcasts. I'm assuming there's actually a lot of daily sports podcasts, probably not so many in the daily sports history. And so we would have to look at that. But I'm assuming that this is a clear kind of differentiator here, where this is probably the only daily sports history show. But when I pulled it up here, the cover art was a little bit surprising to me. We've got the daily sports history in this kind of, green and orange kind of sportsy looking kind of font. But this white gradient, I guess I would call it, coming in from the top and bottom here, it looks like there's maybe some different kind of sports balls, soccer, baseball, volleyball, basketball, football, tennis around the top. That's not really clear to me, but the gradient is a little bit confusing to me what that is meant to do or communicate. And I just can't help but feel like it lowers the perceived quality of it. I think the white draws so much attention to it that it actually pulls my eye away from even this like very large text of daily sports history. So it's very clear, but my eye just keeps going to the light. And this is actually something, so I have a background in photography. And this is one of the things that you learn with both editing and composition, is that you want to light the areas of the photo that you want to draw eye attention to. And so a lot of times after you've taken a photo, you will darken certain areas that you want to pull the eye away from and lighten areas in post-production that you want to draw the eye to. And so looking at this, it's like my eye just keeps going to like top and bottom. And it's like I don't actually want to look at the title, which, it's still impossible to avoid. But that's my kind of first impression, is it doesn't feel quite as like professional or legitimate as I want it to.
Yeah, and this is even more kind of striking when it's on a dark background. Both Spotify and Pocket Casts kind of default to this dark background. And then actually with a white background, it gets kind of washed out. So I think there's room to improve the cover art. It's not terrible, but
No.
if you're looking for somewhere to improve, I think improving the cover art would give you some lift, especially since you're competing against lots of other cover art, even when you're just searching for daily sports history.
Yeah.
So there's some opportunity here to stand out. Even, for example, if you're going to look at sports history this week, we've got this cover art here, and you're comparing it to this here. I think my sense is people would say, "Oh, this is more professional. This is probably, a better quality show." And that might not be
Mhm.
true. Ethan, your show may be 1,000 times better than the History Channel's show. So you want to give yourself the best leg up. And I mean, you're competing against some professional outlets. So
Yeah.
raising the bar on that. The other thing is that cover art, it does not need to be that expensive or time consuming. So if you're not a designer yourself, hiring a cover art designer is actually not that expensive. I've seen even $100 will get you some art, and it can go up from there, but it's worth spending a little bit of money and raising the bar on the cover art.
Yeah, and I think even you look at that, like, ESPN 30 for 30 cover
Mm,
art that was there, that is not a super designy piece of artwork there. And so I think
mhm,
that one of the things that amateur designers, we've talked about this, I think, a little bit before, is it feels like you need to use up all the available space and have something there. Whereas
mhm,
my suspicion is what's going on here is that it's actually this kind of intuited expression of confidence that you're willing to leave blank space and empty space, and that actually it's the same thing about where are you drawing the eye. And the more blank space
mhm.
you leave, the more it sucks it to the kind of very selective visual elements that you include. And so I think
Yeah.
that this is something that with this show, there's quite a bit going on. There's like a background pattern. There's these white elements. There's the two different
Mhm.
colors of the title. And so I would actually probably simplify this, make it bolder. And I think that that would imply kind of more confidence to some extent and kind of draw the eye to the stuff that matters.
Yeah. Now let's get to the description is interesting to me. Let me read it out for you and tell me what you think. Becoming a sports trivia expert has never been easier. In just around 10 minutes a day, that is what daily sports history is here for. Let me just stop right there. What are your thoughts on the promise of the show there?
Oh, so, as two jobs to be done nerds, I'm immediately thinking about the job to be done of this show. And I have
Mhm.
never been a trivia buff, but I know that there are people who take sports and any kind of trivia very seriously. And I actually went to high school with Eric. He was a pretty good friend of mine. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of sports trivia, specifically Dallas Cowboys, and but more broadly as well. And
Mhm.
it was incredible. I was like, "How do you do this?" And this was before podcasting, but I think that if you wanna be that type of person who inspires awe amongst your friends at the sports trivia,
Mhm.
weekly meetup, this is the show that is
Mhm.
going to help get you there, and so I think that that is a fantastic job to be done for somebody who is interested in sports, loves the history about it, loves pieces of trivia. This is the show that in less than 10 minutes a day is gonna help you do that.
And let's get a little mood board here. If I put in sports trivia night into Google Images, it looks like, there's a lot of hot shots, sports bar and grill. That was my thought is like, this is something
Mhm.
that's happening at a bar or a pub.
Yep.
And there's just this very strong job to be done, emotional reason that people would subscribe to the show, which is you go to the bar and you do the trivia night and you're like, I thought I knew sports, but I only know like 30% of these. I've got to get better at this.
Yeah.
Or you get to the bar and you impress your friends with your encyclopedic knowledge of the Dallas Cowboys. And you think to yourself, I want more of that feeling in my life.
Yeah.
So I love this first line of the description. It's a great promise for the show. Who's the show for? People who are into sports trivia. What's the promise of the show? I'm helping you every single day in 10 minutes or less get better at sports trivia so that when you go to the pub, you kick ass. I just
Yeah.
love that idea.
Yeah, and I think for people who might not be sports fans, let alone sports trivia fans, this might seem like a kind of silly little pastime type thing. But what I think is interesting about this is that we all have, like, when you were talking about the actual application of this knowledge, there's actually some stakes here where maybe you're on a
Mhm.
trivia team, and so you might feel like if you can't pull your weight, you might be at risk of being the kind of like outcast of the friend group who's not contributing to the team's goals of winning at trivia. And the kind of opposite side of that is that actually you can stand out and be notable in this environment that you care about a lot. And so I think that we all have these elements of our lives where we are social creatures and we live in communities and we have these different subcultures that we're a part of. And we all care about our status to some extent, whether or not we admit it. And I think that this show taps into that kind of very deep rooted need and desire that people have. And so while on the surface, if you're not into sports, you might be like, why would anybody listen to this every single day? Sports trivia, it seems so silly. But I think we all
Yeah,
have these things that if there was a show like this that would help us elevate our social status, we would all listen to that.
absolutely. Now, given what you just said, though, what do you think about the cover art and the title?
Yeah. So if I'm thinking about this in the context of sports trivia, I think the title could actually be repositioned in some way where it's more like sports trivia oriented, like win at sports trivia or something like that. That's a little bit
Mhm.
cheesy, but that is where my mind goes of like, if somebody is wanting to do that, this feels like a little bit one step removed from the actual desire that people have.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's my first thought. And then the second thought with the cover art is, you just did a Google search of some images related to sports trivia. I would be borrowing heavily from how sports trivia nights are being advertised and promoted and look at how can I kind of fit into this design convention that is already existing and
Mhm.
is like the context that people are thinking about sports trivia so that there's actually some subconscious connection when somebody comes across my show, they're already thinking about some of these other things. And I mean, as you're pulling these up,
Yeah,
these are not necessarily the best designed artwork that's been out there. And I actually wouldn't expect that from, probably a lot of these are like bars and pubs who don't have a graphic
yeah,
designer. They got like the owner who's like mocking something up in Canva. So
yeah.
there's, you kind of have to balance that out. But those are my two kind of conceptual thoughts of how I might think about this.
But even then, it might still be worth copying some of these design conventions because it
Hmm.
immediately creates a connection in the listener's mind.
Yeah.
So it might actually be good to use some of these cheesy elements. When you go into the bathroom of a bar, and there's always women won't know this, but above the urinals, there's always a poster that is like, sports trivia night or something. If you're used to seeing that, then it might be worth copying some of those elements. I actually think it's worth sometimes just playing around with new titles. I mean, he has dailysportshistory.com. Maybe
Hmm.
he's too far gone here, but just as a brainstorming exercise, what are some other titles that could work here that might get people closer to the promise of the show? Sports trivia champion,
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
maybe that's the title that evokes the feeling that you want to have with a prospective listener. Not saying that Ethan should do that, especially since it looks like he's invested in this domain here, dailysportshistory.com. He's got the .com, but these are the kinds of decisions, these branding decisions, that sometimes you'll see a big company change the name of something and you'll think, why did they do that? Well, it's
Hmm.
because positioning matters. And
Yeah.
if you can, when someone is like searching for a way to get better at sports trivia, if you have the words sports trivia in your title and you make it more likely that they're going to find your show and more likely that they're going to click on your show, that might be worth it.
Yeah.
Would it be worth it to you if you got 15% more listeners because of that change? 20%. This is why people do these rebranding exercises. So,
Yeah.
something to consider, maybe not for Ethan in this case, but for whoever's watching this. Sometimes a rebrand that better encompasses the job to be done of the show is worth it.
Yeah, and I think these are the really tough decisions because, like I said when we opened this up, daily sports history, I immediately understand what this is for. I have to do a
Mhm.
little bit of dot connecting in my mind as to how does this fit into my life and why would I want to maybe listen to this show. And so that's
Yeah.
where that potential title change could factor in. And the other thing is like we've talked about this on previous roasts is that his name is the perfect encapsulation of the concept. It's every day you get this 10 minutes or less piece of sports history. And so it's really telling you what
Yeah.
it is. And I think that it's really cohesive, which is great. And so I think that this is one of these really tough decisions. And we don't know necessarily what his download numbers are or how well this is working. But I think if he was in a situation where he's just not happy with the results so far and it feels like things aren't really taking off like he thinks they should, that might be where I would say, okay, what do I have to lose here? Yes, I've got a great concept, but what if I made this tweak? What if I just tested it out? What if I didn't change anything, but for the next month, I just changed the name of my show on
Mm-hmm.
my podcast feed? And maybe I even put sports trivia championship or champion, something like that, and then a pipe,
Yeah.
and then previously daily sports history. Or maybe it's not even previously, it's just daily sports history podcast or daily sports history, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. Then I think he can actually kind of keep the cover art. It still somewhat makes sense, but he can test out this new title and see, okay, is this getting more people in? Or maybe you run a experiment where you have both the cover art and the title change. You leave everything else the same. And if you start to notice, hey, I'm getting more downloads than previously, maybe then you
Yeah.
commit to that. And so I think this is, we've talked about this before. You can run these experiments. There's, you're not going to be penalized for it. Your existing listeners, they're going to be listening regardless. But the only way to find out if there's a better alternative is to actually run the experiment.
And full disclosure, I mean, I showed some of our analytics here. This is our show here. And so Podcast Marketing Trends Explained in the first 30 days is just shy of 300 downloads per episode. This is the perfect time. If you're in this ballpark, this is the perfect time to be experimenting. Don't lock things down. This is the time to, I'm going to try out a new title. I'm going to try out a new description. I'm going to try new cover art because the numbers are still low enough that it's like, well, maybe if I make a change, it might actually give me a lot more lift and get me to the next stage, right?
Yeah. All right, so let's bring it back to the description because we kind of teased it a little bit here. Let's finish it off here. So he's
Mm-hmm.
got becoming a sports trivia expert has never been easier in just around 10 minutes a day. The one thing I will say is that's a little awkward reading it to me that that's two sentences instead of one,
Mm-hmm.
but that's a minor kind of nit to pick there. That's what
Yeah.
daily sports history is here for. Even like all three of those feel like they could be consolidated a little bit. Then he goes on to say, host Ethan Reese, a form college coach. I think that's meant to say former college coach. So it looks like there might be a small typo there. Has been studying sports history for over 20 years. So I love this because this shows his credibility and why he's the perfect person to host this and why he's the person you actually want to listen to on this. So that's a great
Mm-hmm.
element to have in here. Then it says, we will dives into a great moment in sports history every day in under 10 minutes. So there's another kind of minor typo there with dives as plural, covering football, basketball, baseball, hockey, soccer, tennis, and beyond. Your sports knowledge will grow every day as you become a sports historian. By the time you're done reading this, you could already be done with an episode. So listen, learn, and repeat. So I noticed a few other kind of minor typos in there, which I think do matter, even if this is not a English literature type podcast or anything like that. Still, we humans kind of take whatever knowledge is available to us and use that to judge, everything beyond that. And we kind of project that out onto the show as a whole. So I would look at those things. The other thing that really stands out to me here is the presence of exclamation marks. Did you pick up on this?
Yeah. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total. I in this
6, yeah.
description, I think. Yeah.
Almost every sentence.
I would say pull back on the exclamation marks, especially again because remember when people are searching for a show to listen to, they are often comparing you to whatever else shows up on the search screen here. So if we go into the History Channel, they are restrained in how many exclamation marks they use. They've got their typos fixed. You want to be on the same level. Even just using a tool like Grammarly, we could copy and paste this in, and it will quickly give us a lot of corrections that we can make here. It'll suggest, in this case, actually, there's spaces missing, but just put it into Grammarly, get your typos fixed, and then take whatever suggestions they give us here, right? And then you don't want too many exclamation marks, right?
Yeah, and this is, coming from me, I'm somebody who loves exclamation marks, and every single email I send, I kind of have to pull back. I basically start out writing like this with every single sentence has an exclamation mark, and then I have to go back and edit, and like, I look a little too eager here. And so I remove them all after the fact and keep one or two. But I think other than that, I think content-wise, this description is actually really good. It kind of tells you
Hmm.
almost everything that you need to know, and I think that this is another example of the concept is doing the heavy lifting, where from the
Yeah.
title And the first line basically here, we know what the show is about and we understand whether it's for us or not. And so I think that let's maybe move on to the episode titles here.
Yeah, I would say episodes. And the other thing I notice is these episodes are short: 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 6 minutes, seven
Yep.
minutes. So, as a potential new listener, it fits the format of the show, but it also feels accessible. Actually, one of the criticisms of our Podcast Marketing Trends Explained, is our episodes are 45 minutes to an hour. And folks are often like, I'm not going to give you an hour. But here it's like, a small ask, 7 minutes. And the titles themselves, these are definitely moments in history. And I think he's doing a pretty good job. The
Yep.
change that saved the NBA, the shot clock. So
Yeah.
that's great. We're going to learn about the shot clock. Snowboarding, the story of the snurfer. So there's enough here that I'm intrigued. Personally, I would click on the snowboarding one first because I'm a snowboarder.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's Danica Patrick, her first IndyCar win. So there's a nice like subject and then intriguing like byline here. Like, oh, like what am I going to learn about Danica Patrick? Her first IndyCar win. All right, I want to hear about that. What do you think?
I think that the change saved the NBA, the shot clock. The way you read it was the change that saved the NBA, which actually
Mm,
I think that would be a stronger title because it
yeah.
kind of highlights this one thing. But what I do really like about this title is we know what the topic is, the shot clock, but then
Hmm.
it also has this implication that, oh, this actually changed the course of sports history, perhaps. And that now
Yeah.
there's this much bigger story rather than just like talking about the shot clock. It's like, okay, maybe I'm interested in, oh, I didn't realize the shot clock wasn't there from the start. But here it kind of tells us
Hmm.
that, oh, it wasn't always this way. And then this thing happened and it actually changed the course of basketball forever. So I think that
Yeah.
that's actually a great kind of thing that he's got going on there where we've got the specific thing we're talking about and also the impact that it had. It kind of hints at that. A couple others here. There's some that are, it's a bit hit and miss, which I think almost every show is with titles.
Hmm.
The one that is a little bit surprising to me just because I know more of the story is Terry Fox. And so Terry Fox, I would assume he's actually not known outside of Canada really, but
Hmm.
he had cancer as a young man, I don't know, in his 20s or something like that, and had his leg amputated and essentially set out to run across Canada to raise
Yeah.
money for cancer research. And he didn't make it. He died en route. But essentially, like kids around Canada do the Terry Fox run every year on September or something. And which I think was either his birthday or the day he died. And so this is interesting to me that Terry Fox, A Hero's Journey of Hope and Determination, doesn't actually mention anything about cancer or marathon or anything that
Hmm.
might pull people in to the specifics. And so if you don't know Terry Fox, you don't really get anything from that title that might pull you in. And so one of the things you mentioned was you would click on the snowboarding one because you're a snowboarder
Hmm.
and as am I. And so
Yeah.
I'm going to be interested in that. And so I think that that's something to think about with your titles, especially for a show like this, where you talk about a wide variety of topics, is making sure in the title you're giving people who are participants or fans of that sport something that they're immediately like, oh, marathon? Great. I'm interested in that, even though this isn't your typical marathon. And that might actually even be the angle I would take to this is like a marathon unlike any other, or, something like that. That's a kind of cheesy title,
Hmm.
but you're getting somebody who's interested in running. They might not have heard of Terry Fox, but they're like, oh, okay, I'm interested in running. I'm definitely going to look at this one. And then you realize, oh, there's this whole other story behind it.
Yeah. Oh, here's a great title: Ping Pong Diplomacy
I was
Using
just
Sports
looking
for
at that one.
Peace.
Yeah.
Some of these titles are great. Like some
Yeah.
of these are A++ titles. And yeah, there's a few here that maybe could be improved, but there's some drama in some of these.
So I feel like maybe we've looked at a few of these titles. Maybe we should take one of these for a spin and listen to the first minute or so.
And before we do that, one thing folks I think I've seen is that there is episode cover art here, and often it does a pretty good job of matching up with the title.
Yeah.
Some of these are more compelling than others, but I like if you were going to scroll through the episodes on Spotify, for example, at least there's something relating to each of these. If I see the snurfer is here
Yeah.
cover art, it's like that does kind of lead me to want to click. So
Yeah.
nice to see some custom episode cover art.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to listen to the first minute of this snowboarding one.
I will join you.
All
Let's
right.
kick it off in 3, 2, 1.
On April 16th, 1998, the patent for the snurfer was issued, which started out as a winter toy to surf down snowy hills, leading to the global sport of snowboarding, which, if not for one decision, snurfing would have been the sport we all know today. In the Olympics, here's the story behind how snowboarding got started today on Daily Sports History.
Get ready for Puck Drop at BetMGM, an official sports betting partner of the National Hockey League. BetMGM.com for terms and conditions. Must be 19 years of age or older. Ontario only. Please play responsibly.
Just got
If
a
you
really
have
loud
questions
ad.
or concerns about your gambling or someone close to you, please contact Connex Ontario at 1-866-531-2600 to speak to an advisor free of charge. BetMGM operates pursuant to an operating agreement with iGaming Ontario.
Welcome to Daily Sports History.
All right. So, Justin, your thoughts on the first minute of the Snurfer episode here on snowboarding?
I like how he brings it in right away.
Mhm.
So right off the top, it's like in the year, dun, 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 this, dun,
Yep.
dun, 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 dun. So I think that's a great intro. I then got a extremely loud dynamic ad. You didn't get it on your side, did you?
I didn't know. So it must
Oh
be
man,
geo-targeted.
because this does inform the first experience of the show, Ethan, I would see if you can get those ads normalized, because that ad was very loud. It sounded way louder. Usually minus 16 loofs is kind of good podcast volume, and that ad was much, much louder. So yeah, then a very loud ad, and then into the intro of the show where he goes, I'm Ethan, this is what the show is about. I think that's a pretty good way to approach things. Give folks a little tease of what the episode's going to be about. Here's what we're going to be talking about. And he did it in a dramatic way. I would, again, normalize that ad if you're going to have it, and then come back and say, okay, well, I'm Ethan. This is what the promise of the show is. Let's get into it.
Yeah, so I did not have the ad, so that did not kind of detract from my experience of the show. One of the things that I usually think about with podcasting too is like when you're starting out, you have to kind of make this trade-off between what's more important to me, getting, let's just say for some of these ads, maybe you're getting, a couple dozen dollars a month or something like that. Like it's not going to be life-changing money or anything, or is it growth? And you have to think about like the experience that you had, Justin, where like this ad just blew your ears off. That is a extremely negative impression that even though it's not your ad, people will blame you for putting it on there. Like most people don't understand that dynamic ad insertion works how it does. And they think that the host has put the ad in there like that, and that the rest, they're going to experience more of this throughout the episode. And so, especially when you're competing with ESPN and the History Channel and all these other outlets where it's going to be high level of production, we don't want to give somebody that experience within the first 10 seconds. And so this is something that I think if growth of the show is your goal, you actually want to eliminate all of that potential friction. And you talk to enough successful creators and you really internalize this idea that they are 100% focused on the long game, that they are willing to defer on any short-term gains and monetization and profitability and even growth in many instances to get that in a greater amount in the long term. And I think that this is something that a lot of creators who like get in, they're like, I want to monetize my podcast immediately. And they have, 20 downloads an episode. And it's like, well, I mean, if you try to monetize it now, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot for longer term success. And so a lot of times it's about actually saying like, okay, I'm not going to worry about this right now. And I'm going to have more opportunities later if I really build the product first and make something really great and actually build up a bit of anticipation and maybe even some demand from sponsors or things like that. And like, that's where you're actually going to get the more meaningful income down the line. So I don't really know what Ethan's perspective is on this right now, but I have talked to so many people who approach it this way that I think usually that's not actually serving you in either monetization or growth in the short term.
And with a show like this, we can imagine other monetization possibilities. These aren't guaranteed, but if he had a Patreon, for example, where as a Patreon member, you get flashcards to practice sports trivia, right? So you could give people bonuses, or you could just sell that as your own thing. Ethan could give the teaser and he goes, but before we get started, I've just introduced my new hockey flashcards. If you really want to get good at answering hockey trivia questions, you can get my flashcard pack for $5. Just go to my website, dailysportshistory.com.
Yeah.
That would be a great ad. It actually is applicable to this audience. It's applicable to the job to be done. And you might find, yeah, even if you're only selling a dozen of these a month, that it's better than what you're
Yeah.
getting from these ads.
Yeah. It makes me think an alternative or even complementary product here would be, I imagine there are people who actually do organize trivia nights or want to
Mm.
be the organizer and could use a kind of starter kit. And so
Mm-hmm.
Ethan's done all this work, all this research. He is the expert on this. That would be a really interesting kind of package to put together. It's like the trivia organizer. You get all your questions basically that your friends have never heard of before, and you get to put that together. And so that would be another
Mm-hmm.
that kind of complements both the flashcard set maybe, but also this organizer set that you could probably charge even more. You could bundle together all of these different, you can get your hockey, you could get your basketball, you could get golf, you could get different eras. There are so many ways that you could build this out that I actually think there's a legitimate business to be had there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's so other possibilities too. Like if I go sports trivia app, I could just search for all of these
Mm-hmm.
sports trivia apps on the App Store, and I could reach out to Super Lucky Games and just say, hey, I have got the audience for your app. They're listening to my podcast every day. Why don't you advertise on my show? You can make these deals directly as well. I'm kind of feeling like if these dynamic ads aren't, making you a considerable amount of money, I would remove them, and then you can really focus on making those first 60 seconds just incredible. And then, maybe halfway through the show, put your own host read ad in the middle where you pitch either your own membership, your own Patreon, something, but your show is only 8 minutes long or something. Make that first 60 seconds, that's 1/8 of your show. Make it really count.
Yep. You look at this in any medium, and essentially the advice is always the same. Like in writing, it's like make the first sentence and the first paragraph pull people in and want to read the next one. And I just was watching this video on screenwriting today, and it was a guy who works in Hollywood screening scripts for one of the big studios. And so he reads hundreds or thousands of scripts. And he said basically the typical screener or whatever they're called only reads the first two scenes of a screenplay. And he said 99% of people get that far and then they leave it. It's off their desk. And so
Mm-hmm.
he made this point that was fascinating. He's like, this person, to get the screenplay there, has climbed this mountain. It's this Herculean effort. Not only have you written the screenplay, which must have taken probably years, and then you have done all this work to get it into the hands of the person at the studio. And then they spend 2 minutes reading the first two scenes and they're like, this didn't grab me, and it's off their desk. And I think that this so perfectly illustrated the challenge that we are all up against, because listeners are doing the exact same thing. We have so much opportunity and so much choice just a click away that it has to grab us in that first 60 seconds. And if it doesn't, we're on to the next thing.
Yes. Yeah. Anything else about the snippet that you heard?
Yeah. So I didn't get the ad, but then I did get some music that came in, and there was some music, then like a swooshing sound effect, then the general kind of show intro that goes in every episode, I'm assuming, then another swoosh. That felt a little disjointed to me. And so it didn't feel like smooth production. And the other thing that I noticed is his audio quality wasn't terrible, but it made me notice it. And this is a question that a lot of people have about, like, how good does my show quality need to be? And I think it needs to be good enough that the listener doesn't notice it. And so one thing here, I think, was the microphone was probably not a great mic. And so you don't need to get like a great mic, but you can get like a $50 mic that does perfectly fine. I think the bigger thing here was it doesn't sound like there's any kind of compression happening. And so it felt kind of like, and this is getting into audio engineering kind of nerdy stuff here, but most kind of editing software will have like an equalizer and a compressor will be the two most basic plugins that you'll have to be able to kind of treat your sound a little bit. And they'll usually have presets that you can kind of just say like male voice, and it'll be like, that's your compressor setting, and just like male radio voice or something like that. And, if you're a pro sound engineer, probably wouldn't use presets at all. But for the average kind of indie creator, these will improve things a lot. And what essentially a compressor does is it just kind of smushes the volume on your voice. So it's always at the same level. So if you're like louder at sometimes, it brings that down. If you're quieter at sometimes, then it brings that up. And so it makes this nicer, kind of like richer, fuller listener experience. And most of what we listen to in terms of podcasts and radio and music all has been quite heavily compressed. And so there is this feeling of professionalism that comes with that. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of different tools, Alphonic and a bunch of others that can do a lot of this for you. Descript with Studio Sound does this. Adobe Audio Enhance does this as well. So there's a lot of options that you can kind of just plug into and slap on that will improve things. And I think that that would immediately kind of raise my perceived quality of the show when I first start listening.
Yeah. The only other thing I think we should talk about is ratings and reviews. He's already got 2 5-star reviews here in Spotify, and over on Apple Podcasts, he's got 3 5-star reviews. It's a great start. Ethan, if I was you, I would be encouraging your listeners to rate and review, especially get some written reviews here on Apple Podcasts. Get some folks to leave a written review. You can incentivize that by doing a contest. For example, on Jeremy and I's show, anybody who leaves a rating and review and then leaves the name of their podcast gets an opportunity to have us roast them. And so you can do something similar, encourage and incentivize folks to review your show.
Yeah, I think in his case, there is a great opportunity here to get his audience to recommend different kind of events in sports history that they want to see covered, or even just talking about, what is their favorite obscure sport or something like that. Or like, there's a way to get some more engagement that's relevant to the show that kind of creates a bit of a conversation. And I really like the nominating different people in sports, different athletes, different stories that haven't really been covered, or things that we know about that there might be a hidden backstory. And I think if your audience is sports trivia nerds, probably they have a lot of knowledge and wisdom to be able to share and feed back into the show. That's only going to make it easier to keep going and more kind of community oriented.
Oh, that's a good tip. That's a good tip. I'm going to give you a 5-star review in Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Ethan, because I want to see you succeed. And folks, if you want your show to get roasted by Jeremy and I, you can leave us a review. Like I said, in Apple Podcasts, search for Podcast Marketing Trends Explained. Just leave us the title of your show and we will consider you for a future roast.